David, talking about himself when he was the king of Israel, said, "Behold, you've made my days as a handbreadth, my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath." So there are no good people, and there is only short contribution of time that we can make to the world. However, God in his wisdom and power chooses some people who are not good to have a very good impact on human history. And it is his doing, but through willing people. And we're talking about one of them today. I have to say something about Gandhi. Gandhi was raised as part of an upper-class family in India, not poor. He went to London to be educated, became a lawyer, and was enjoying the wealth and social ties of being among the elite in London society. However, he got sent to South Africa to defend the English against the blacks in South Africa who were not obeying the apartheid policy. And as he tried to defend his country against the horrible things they were doing to the blacks, his whole mind got reversed. And he said, "What am I doing defending the oppressor when it's the oppressed that need defending?" And so he went back to India, and for the next 40 years led India's movement toward independence from England. And he said, you must be the change, not think about the change, hope for the change, pray for the change. You have to be the change that you want to see in this world. Martin Luther King was also raised in a fairly well-to-do family. His father had gone to college, had a college degree, and was pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is one of the most prominent churches in Atlanta. His mother, Alberta Williams, his grandmother, Jeannie Parks Williams. Here's Martin, firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn. And later, he said, "I think my strong determination for justice comes from the very strong, dynamic personality of my father. And I would hope that the gentle aspect comes from a mother who is very gentle and sweet." During the latter years of Martin Luther King's life, after he did a pilgrimage to India and studied Gandhi's life and the place that Gandhi had worked, he hung the picture of Mahatma Gandhi in his office. And this is very revealing to me, how when I was in theological school studying the scriptures and studying God, I thought the only way we could solve our problem of segregation was an armed revolt. I felt the Christian ethic of love was confined to individual relationships. I couldn't see how it would work in social conflict. This is when he was young. Then I read of Gandhi's ethic of love as revealed in Jesus and raised to a social strategy for social transformation. This lifts love from individual relationships to the place of social transformation. This Gandhi helped us to understand, and for this we are grateful a decade after his death. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote this tribute, published in the Hindustan Times in India, giving credit to the man who changed his thinking about social reform. I'll do this briefly. He only lived 39 years. Firstborn son, lived on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, which was considered the Black Wall Street. The powerful, the influential, the wealthy black people lived on the street with Martin Luther King's family. He went to college at 15, skipped 2 grades in high school because he was so advanced. Started college at age 15, and he was mentored by a man called Benjamin Mays, who said, "Too much of our religion is about the hereafter. What about the here and now?" At 22, he got his degree from Crozier Theological Seminary, Bachelor of Divinity. He was elected the president of a student body that was 80% white. Tells you something about him. He married Coretta Scott, who was studying voice at the New England Conservatory of Music, 24, and at age 26, he had gotten a Bachelor of Divinity and a PhD in theology from Boston U, and accepted his first pastorate at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He went back to his roots, could have worked in any university, could have been a professor of theology, but he felt the call to go back home. And we're going to go over these 12 short years before he was assassinated at age 39. Here's Coretta, his wife, and here's the last family portrait taken of Martin Luther King's family in '66, less than 2 years before he was assassinated. Dexter Scott, age 5. Yolanda was the oldest of the 4 King children. Here's Father Martin. Here's the youngest, Bernice Albertine. Coretta, his wife. And here's Martin Luther King III. That was his family. Something very unusual happened that he did not plan, but he was chosen to participate. This woman, Rosa Parks, was a resident of Montgomery, where Martin Luther King was the pastor of the church. She refused to respond to the bus driver's command to get up out of her seat and move to the back so the white people could sit in her seat. She just said no. She was arrested, put in jail, fingerprinted, and sat in jail. And they said, if you'll just pay the $10 fine and $4 in court costs, we'll consider this done. And she said, no, I didn't do anything wrong. She hired a lawyer. Turned out that person became the president of the NAACP. They took it through the Alabama courts. The Alabama courts, went through the regional courts, ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And there they ruled that bus segregated seating was unconstitutional, and that was the end of it. However, in the meantime, for over a year, all the black people in Montgomery refused to ride the bus. That was 70% of the people who used the bus. And that boycott was led by the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, love that word, we're going to improve things, Martin Luther King. So Rosa Parks had the guts and determination to get MLK involved, and historians believe that this event and that year was the spark that started the civil rights movement in the United States. Whoops. Oh, there we go. So, Martin Luther King spent most of those 12 years leading demonstrations and speaking in public. And he was asked, why are you doing such aggressive, direct action? Why don't you just write about it and talk about it? Why are you doing these things? Why the sit-ins, the marches? Isn't negotiation a better path to change? He says, yeah, you're right in calling for negotiation. That's the very purpose of our direct action. Nonviolent, Gandhi's nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront an important issue. That was his purpose. It culminated, I guess you would call this the mountaintop of the civil rights movement, in 1963, August 28. I wish I would have been there, but I was 11 years old. My mom didn't let me go. The March on Washington, as it's now known, was actually organized as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This wasn't just the civil rights folks involved. Many American labor unions, including the president of the United Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther, was there and helped organize it, and Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, religious organizations all helped to organize it. 250,000 people gathered on the mall between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. There were 12 speeches given that day by various people, and Martin Luther King was chosen to have the last words. And I'm grateful they made that decision, because out of that speaking for 17 minutes, we have probably the most crystallized statement of the dream of racial equality. And we're going to be doing that a little bit later together. What is going on? So, some of the outcomes of Martin Luther King's deeds. John Kennedy, before he was assassinated, introduced and it was passed by Congress, the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Sounds good, but all of the civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, felt it went way short of actually putting into law what needed to be put into law. And so after Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King became close friends with Lyndon Johnson, the next president. They met many times in Washington, long talks, and out of that, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, which basically said you cannot prevent an adult from voting in the United States. That was action. Kennedy's stuff was mostly ideas and good principles, but now we're into action. And I apologize, as I would apologize to medical students, for putting something you can't read on the screen. But allow me to just share some of the highlights. Selma to Montgomery was a march that occurred in 1965 in February. The beginning of the march was called Bloody Sunday. 50 people trying to cross the bridge out of Selma toward Montgomery were not just met by the police, they were attacked by the police with billy clubs, and they were beaten into submission, many of them hospitalized, and this was available on national television. You could watch it happening on television. National support was mobilized for the people who were simply marching to obtain voting rights and other, what we would call, normal privileges in the state of Alabama. So later, the same group tried to do it again, was met by the police and the National Guard again, and rather than get beaten up again, they turned around. Meanwhile, the courts were involved, and there was a judge whose name I can't read, allowed the march to happen again. On the third time, Martin Luther King and his wife Coretta were at the head of the march. This time, there were thousands of people on the march, not 50, not a few hundred. And they came to that bridge, and by court order, all the law enforcement officers had to move aside. And they allowed them to go across the bridge to the Capitol building in Alabama, and Martin Luther King spoke there and gave a speech. How long are we going to have this kind of a country? Not long, and he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. During the last 2 years of his life, he continuously spoke, organized rallies. He became involved in the Vietnam War controversy. It tore him up because the scripture says that we should honor those in government and our leaders, but that conflicted with his conviction that there was an immoral aspect to the Vietnam War. After months of struggling, he finally came out against the Vietnam War. But for his work in civil rights, he was daily receiving death threats from people in the South. He had bodyguards watching the crowd every time he spoke. His father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., advised him to stop speaking in public for fear that he would be killed. And on April 4th, he was outside the motel room, standing outside on a balcony, and shot and killed, age of 39. The leaders of the civil rights movement asked, by the way, he was killed in Memphis, then transported to Alabama. I said Alabama. I meant Atlanta. Starts with A. He's transported to Atlanta, where he had grown up, and the governor was asked that they do a state funeral and put him in Lyon State in the Georgia Capitol. The governor said, no, he's an enemy of our country. No state funeral for Martin Luther King. And then the governor said he's not even going to lower the flag to half-mast. But the federal government stepped in and said, no, you're wrong. That's the federal flag. It will be lowered to half-mast. He went, there was a funeral service at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. It could only hold 1,300 people. That's how many were there. And his close friend, Mahalia Jackson, sang his favorite hymn, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. They put his casket on a wooden farm wagon, and mules, Bell and Ada, donated by a local farmer, pulled this farm wagon with Martin Luther King's casket 3.5 miles from the church to Morehouse College, where he had gone to college at age 15. And the same president who mentored him in college gave his eulogy. And here was his request. No mention of honors or awards. He had told his wife, Coretta, if I die, I want nothing mentioned about my accomplishments. But he asked that it be said he tried to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, be right on the war question, and love and serve humanity. So just a few things by way of legacy that happened. After the March on Washington, the committee in Oslo, Norway, voted him the Nobel Peace Prize. And as part of that speech, and you kind of have to read this sentence twice to know what he's talking about, I refuse to accept the idea that the isness, meaning the way we are now, of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness of the Scriptures, loving our brother as ourselves, that forever confronts him. His mind did not live in the reality. His mind lived in what should be, not what is. Coretta King and Stevie Wonder and a lot of other people organized a march on Washington again. This time, there was more than 300,000 people who came to Washington to celebrate his legacy. 2 great biographies, both winning Pulitzer Prizes, were written in the 80s. I encourage you to read either or both. In November, the national holiday was established, but believe it or not, 20 years after the March on Washington, there were a significant number of congressmen and senators who opposed the idea of reserving a holiday for this man. It took a lot of discussion in Congress before that holiday was approved, and now we have a national memorial built near the Lincoln Memorial on the mall. So, I would have loved to play the video of his speech. It's an incomparable experience to hear him talk. But as a substitute, because we couldn't get the copyright to show the speech, we're going to do a responsive reading, and I would ask you to pretend that you're on the podium in the Washington Mall where Martin Luther King sat speaking to 250,000 people outdoors, with microphones, of course. Speak loudly so that the people in the back of that group can hear you, and I'll try to do the same. The blue is for you all to read. I'll read the black. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light and hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice.
It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long nights of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land.
When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir.
This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned.
Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation.
So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit paths of racial justice.
Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood.
Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content after this demonstration will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
Yes. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds.
Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.
We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline.
We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence.
Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force.
The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people, for many of our white brothers as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied?
We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, but cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities.
We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one.
We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs saying, "For whites only."
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Now, interjection. Mahalia Jackson was sitting not far from Dr. King, and she said loud enough for him to hear, "Martin, tell them about your dream." At which point, he began to go off script into the most powerful portion of his speech. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you, my friends, that even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
I have a dream that one day down in Alabama with its vicious racist, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
I have a dream today that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, and the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight.
And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with.
With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing."
Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to become a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring.
Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city,
we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics,
will be able to join hands and singing the words of the old Negro spiritual.
Free at last.
Read it with me. Free at last.
Free
Thank
at
God
last.
Almighty.
We are free at last. Sorry, Paul.
Singers. Hymn that was often sung during marches and during demonstrations, and as the people were gathering, the 250,000 people on the mall in 1963, this is the hymn they frequently sang. Please join us. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. God will see us through. God will see us through. God will see us through someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We shall overcome someday.
Can I ask you to cross aisles, get together with your friends and hold hands? And if you're COVID scared, we have sanitizer out in the foyer. Come together, scoot together. It starts with us, brothers and sisters. It's been going on for a long time. There's still hatred in the world. There's still strife and hurt and pain. People are still harassed because of their faith, because of their color, because of their ethnicity, whatever. But Christ is calling us to come together as a people of one and live as people of love, to break the barriers that are there. And so that is what I'm hoping we will do. This afternoon, I want us to say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Amen. You may be seated. Happy New Year, friends and family. I can hardly believe that it's 2023. 2022 wasn't easy for all of us. I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to this new year and being filled with God's courage and strength. And in fact, just today, a friend of mine sent me this Bible verse, and I've seen it 3 times this week, so I think God was trying to say something to me, so I thought I would share it with you. It's Joshua 1:9. We're familiar with this text. It says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Isn't that a great promise? God is with us wherever we go. We have nothing to be afraid of, nothing to fear. He says, don't fear. I just love that I can rest in God's everlasting arms and trust Him to take care of my life. We want to invite you to come and worship with us in January and February. We've got some wonderful things planned. January, we're going to be looking at some foundational truths of what we need in our lives to just walk with the Lord on a daily basis. And in February, we're celebrating Black History Month, and I'm really excited because we've got some fun things planned for you, some special speakers, some drama, and some great music. And so we just would love to see you. But if you're still sitting at home, we're glad that you're watching us, and we're so happy that you're joining us. Be strong. Be of good courage. God is with you.